Alexander Volkanovski versus Ilia Topuria is happening in the main event of UFC 298, and I am beyond hyped for this card. This feels like the first real big UFC event of the year, and every single fight on the main card is going to be super hyped with just great matchups. We are doing the main event challenge for myself where I predict every single main event, and maybe if I'm confident, I'll even bet on it. So far, I have hit every single one, and I want to see if I can keep the streak alive going into UFC 298. That, however, is easier said than done because Volkanovski versus Topuria has had me racking my mind trying to decide who I think is going to win this fight. I always knew Ilia Topuria was good, and when he was matched up against Bryce Mitchell, I jumped at the chance of picking him. And I believe he was only like a minus 150 favorite. So I really jumped at the chance and I put some money down on Ilia Topuria at those odds because I knew he was such a good hard hitter. He was able to knock out lightweights. He was able to take knockout blows from lightweights, and he had wrestling to back up that power. So after he beat Bryce Mitchell, I knew he was good, but I wasn't expecting him to be title level contender. And then he fought Josh Emmett and he 10-7'd him. He 10-7 Josh Emmett, who then went on to completely knock out cold Bryce Mitchell. So you know Josh Emmett still has some juice left in the gas tank. And not only did he perform well against Josh Emmett, but he showed major improvements compared to his previous fight against Bryce Mitchell. He was still swinging wildly in some parts, but for the most part, he really toned everything down, kept things nice and tidy, and really stuck to the fundamentals, the jab, the cross, having extremely good defense to defend against Josh Emmett's power shots, having good wrestling fundamentals, not only to defend Josh Emmett's takedown attempts, but also to control Josh Emmett on the ground or even up against the cage when he had Josh Emmett hurt. And that was a really just mature performance from a fighter who was fighting recklessly not that long ago. And so that made me all the more excited because after seeing that fight, I knew Ilia Topuria was extremely talented and only getting better every single fight. Which brings me to the dilemma, because that improvement, that unseen improvement between fights makes predicting Topuria versus Volkanovski even harder. So let's break down these two fighters. Let's start off with their stats. Alexander Volkanovski, 26 wins, 3 defeats. He is 35 years old, 5'6", 71.5-inch reach. Ilia Topuria undefeated at 14 wins. He's 27 years old, 8 years younger, 5'7", 1 inch taller, and a 69-inch reach. I don't think the records for either of these guys are going to be too important. We all kind of already know what the records say about them. Ilia Topuria enters the UFC and fights Youssef Zalal on Fight Island during the height of the pandemic. He wins a unanimous decision against him, kind of just wrestle fucking him to a victory. Then he knocks out Damon Jackson in round 1, knocks out Ryan Hall in round 1, knocks out Jai Herbert in round 2, completely destroys Bryce Mitchell and ends up choking him out in round 2, and then completely destroys Josh Emmett. So what I love about Ilia Topuria is that as the opponents he's fighting are getting harder, he's just getting better. And that just makes me so excited to see his performance against Alexander Volkanovski. Let's just take a quick look at Volkanovski's record. Obviously, it's well known, but let's just start from the same pandemic era that we did with Topuria. So he defends his belt against Max Holloway, and I think other than the Islam fights, this has been his hardest fight in the last 4 years. Defends his belt against Holloway, wins a split decision, extremely close fight. Then he fights against Brian Ortega after competing on the Ultimate Fighter against him. That was a very fun fight. I thought that Volkanovski kind of had it in the bag from the beginning of the fight, but obviously famously surviving those crazy submission attempts in round 3 from Brian Ortega. That's probably one of the best rounds of the decade in my opinion. Easily beating an over the hill Korean Zombie and Chan Sung Jung, and then probably Volkanovski's greatest performance of his career against Max Holloway in the trilogy fight, where he just 50-45'd him and put away all doubt. Then, after styling on Max Holloway, blowing everyone's minds, he earns a spot to move up to lightweight and fight against Islam Makhachev. Loses that fight against, in my opinion, the greatest fighter in the world right now. I do agree with Islam's team that Islam had a horrible weight cut and rehydration, and that was probably the worst version of Islam that we're going to see in a long time. But nonetheless, Volkanovski did put up a really good fight against Islam. I love watching that fight to learn more about both guys. And then we see kind of a curious thing where Volkanovski goes back down to featherweight and he fights against Yair Rodriguez, and he really utilizes his wrestling. So it seems like the wrestling he was working on for the Islam fight stuck with him, and he used it against Yair Rodriguez, which, let's be honest, that shouldn't really be surprising because Yair Rodriguez is famous for just kind of falling over, and his striking is really good. So take advantage of his lack of wrestling or anti-wrestling by taking him down. Then, after just kind of dominating Yair Rodriguez, even though I would put an asterisk on that performance because he did really badly headbutt Yair Rodriguez in round 3, I think that this fight could be taken with a grain of salt, maybe even turn into a no contest, because that headbutt really seemed to be significant in contributing to the end of the fight. But neither here nor there. He then goes up and fights Islam Makhachev, famously on 10 days notice, and gets knocked out with a head kick, which he says he just got caught with it, but he was unprepared in that fight. So, Ilia Topuria versus Alexander Volkanovski. Let's break down their styles and see how their styles mesh against each other, and then try to determine who we think is going to win the fight. Volkanovski's striking game is good. It's very good. What makes his striking so elite? In my opinion, Volkanovski is best when his opponent is coming to him. We can look at his performances against guys with iron chins. Max Holloway is definitely included in that. Brian Ortega will just keep coming forward after taking a beating. Korean Zombie is literally got his nickname from walking forwards like a zombie into oncoming strikes. And Yair Rodriguez, I would also say, falls under the category of iron chin, who fights aggressively with not a real solid concept of defense. Alexander Volkanovski has thrived in a division full of these iron warriors that just walk forward with reckless abandon, and I think that his style has adapted to that environment, and thus he works best when his opponents are walking to him. We can see a perfect example of this when Max Holloway, in their second fight, walks forward. Volkanovski throws a counter strike. He loves this kind of move, countering his opponents, being first and last in these exchanges, jumping in, exchanging, jumping out. What happens when his opponents don't come to him? When we talk about his opponents' defense, I think that Ilia Topuria has the second best defense out of all of the opponents that Volkanovski will have faced by this Saturday, with Islam Makhachev being the first best defense. Islam Makhachev did not recklessly come forwards. He does not rely on his chin or his offensive output to protect himself like so many of Alexander Volkanovski's opponents did in the past. Instead, he waits for Volkanovski to come to him, and at times will change up the pace of the fight by allowing Volkanovski to believe that it's time to move in, and instead of moving backwards like he does so often, he'll stand his ground and fire back. We'll get to those counter strikes later on in the video. For now, I want to go over a few examples of what Volkanovski tends to do when his opponents force him to come to them. We might as well talk about stances right now. Volkanovski does switch stances a lot, but he predominantly stays in the orthodox stance. So does Ilia Topuria. Volkanovski runs in with a 3-punch combination, ending up going to Islam's head. Islam circles away from it. Again, Volkanovski runs in, ending with the same overhand left. His opponent runs away from it, grabs Volkanovski by the back of the head, pushes him down as he circles off to Volkanovski's left side. Note how Islam is circling away from Volkanovski and not running straight backwards. This is going to be important later on. Again, in the Islam fight, we have Volkanovski essentially throwing the same exact combination, Islam circles away. This time Volkanovski makes an adjustment and throws out a leg kick on Islam. Here we can see an example of Volkanovski's stance switching being effective against his opponent. He starts out in orthodox, throws a right-left combination, ends up in orthodox again, steps in deep with his left foot, steps in deep with his right foot. He is now in southpaw, completely changed his stance, and fires what is now his rear hand straight down the pipe and has a clean connection on his opponent. This is a great example of stance switching being effective to land your strikes. Leg kicks are a big part of Volkanovski's game. While he will throw naked leg kicks at distance while he's just staring at his opponent, I think that his best leg kicks thrown are at the end of his blitzing combinations. As we can see here, he likes to end his combinations forward by veering off to the side and landing a leg kick on his opponents. I think that this is a great combination because he's forcing his opponent's movement, and even if he's missing with his strikes with his hands, he's connecting with something while also creating a safe amount of distance for him to not have to worry about being counter-striked. Again, another good leg kick ending his combination. I think that it's important to cover these blitzes that Volkanovski performs against Islam Makhachev because Ilia Topuria has a similar style of defense where he will not plod forward and he will be happy to cede ground in order to stay defensively safe against his opponents. We can see here Josh Emmett throws a almost shot for shot same combination as the ones that Volkanovski throws, and Ilia Topuria reacts similarly to how Islam Makhachev reacted to Volkanovski's attack on him. You can almost transpose Alexander Volkanovski into this shot and you'll have the exact same combination. I think that this would have been a perfect time for Josh Emmett to land the leg kick, and this just shows how Volkanovski is one step ahead of his competition in the featherweight division. This also brings me back to the idea that Islam Makhachev was circling away from his opponent. Ilia Topuria hasn't really shown an ability or inclination to circle away. He more retreats directly backwards, which is fine as long as you have the space to retreat directly backwards. But if Volkanovski is able to pressure Topuria up against the cage and then start blitzing him, if he retreats, that footwork is going to be useless because there's no area for him to retreat to. Here's another combination thrown by Josh Emmett that showcases Ilia's good defense. He has a very active and defensively sound guard that he will also not be afraid to open up in order to throw counter shots back at his opponent. Again, Ilia Topuria just moving backwards and being defensively sound. And here we see Ilia Topuria doing the exact same thing that Volkanovski did in the first shot that we showed, where he baits a strike out of his opponent and will throw over the top. I think that this clip is relevant to the Volkanovski fight because if Ilia Topuria stays defensively sound and patient, there is a high likelihood that Volkanovski will start throwing these blitzing in combinations, attacking in straight lines, and then veering off at the last second. And these counter shots that Ilia Topuria showed against Josh Emmett are going to be live. Speaking of counter shots, let's go back to the Islam Makhachev versus Alexander Volkanovski, their first fight. Volkanovski, as good as his leg kicks are to finish combinations, he doesn't always finish combinations with leg kicks. And we can see that as much as we criticized Ilia Topuria for swinging big and missing in the Bryce Mitchell fight and in the Josh Emmett fight, Alexander Volkanovski did the same thing against Islam here. This is a big mistake and a huge window of opportunity to be countered. Something that Islam Makhachev picked up on and took advantage of about 5 minutes later. Again, a big swing with Alexander Volkanovski's right arm. And this time, Islam Makhachev isn't retreating away. He knows that Alexander Volkanovski is going to overswing with his right arm, and he capitalizes on it with a beautiful left hand down the center, perfect form. You can see the twist that it got from the connection on Volkanovski, sends him reeling back across the octagon. Again, Islam Makhachev staying defensively sound. He forces Alexander Volkanovski to come to him. What do we have here? Volkanovski throws a left hand, exactly what Josh Emmett did against Ilia Topuria. And again, it wasn't a big overhand right that missed, but it doesn't matter. Volkanovski is out of position, and Islam Makhachev this time lands at elbow, which actually opens up a cut across Volkanovski's left eye. Volkanovski nods in approval, acknowledging the strike landed. And again, this is the exact same strike that Ilia Topuria just landed on Josh Emmett that we just went over. Volkanovski extends with a left hand. Islam Makhachev comes in over the top, gets a clean connection on Volkanovski. Let's go back to the Josh Emmett one. Josh Emmett extends a left hand. Ilia Topuria sees it, comes in over the top of the strike. It's the exact same move from Emmett that Volkanovski did, and it's the exact same reaction from Topuria that Islam Makhachev did. It's just a clean counter strike, and I think these counter strikes are going to be available for Topuria if he stays patient and forces Volkanovski to come to him. So Volkanovski likes it when his opponents come to him, and he is not as comfortable when his opponents are being patient and he is forced to attack his opponents. This would be a good time to talk about each of these fighters' physical attributes. Volkanovski, as I said before, has a very good use of his long range and arms. His reach is very long, and he uses that to punch over the top of his opponents. He is great at being first and last. What does that mean? It means that he'll throw a strike, his opponent will try to counter the strike, and then he'll counter the counter. That is a great use of his arms. He has great eyes at seeing strikes, and his footwork is great. But what he doesn't have is what Ilia Topuria excels in, which is power. Ilia Topuria just has more knockouts than Volkanovski does. Volkanovski's has knocked out Yair Rodriguez and Korean Zombie in his last few fights. Ilia Topuria submitted Bryce Mitchell, but that was after beating him up. He knocked out Jai Herbert, he knocked out Ryan Hall, he knocked out Damon Jackson. It is just a fact that he has more power in his hands than Volkanovski does. This power is something that Volkanovski himself has acknowledged, saying that Ilia only has a puncher's chance of beating him, and that really the only way he can lose is if he gets caught. I would also say that Ilia Topuria has a better chin than Volkanovski does. Not only has Ilia Topuria survived big punches, Volkanovski has also shown a susceptibility to big punches. Topuria got head kicked by Jai Herbert, who is a lightweight, and for all intents and purposes, he should have been knocked out, but somehow he survived, got onto a single leg from Jai Herbert, and wrestled his way to survival, and came back in the next round to knock Jai Herbert clean out, whereas Volkanovski has done similar in the past, getting knocked down by Max Holloway and wrestling his way to winning that, but he just has a larger history of being knocked down by his opponents, such as Chad Mendes knocking him down, Max Holloway knocking him down multiple times, Islam Makhachev knocking him down, and then Islam Makhachev knocking him out in their rematch. So Ilia Topuria has better power and a better chin. Seeing all of this and seeing how Ilia Topuria's strengths in the striking department match up perfectly against Alexander Volkanovski's weaknesses in the striking department made me lean towards picking Ilia Topuria to beat Alexander Volkanovski. And then I heard Volkanovski's pre-fight interview where he said that the only way Ilia Topuria was going to win is to catch him, and that he was going to, quote, ragdoll Ilia Topuria in the octagon. That, combined with the fact that in his last 3 fights, he was working heavily on wrestling, makes me believe that Volkanovski is going to implement a wrestling-heavy game plan against Ilia Topuria on Saturday. And that realization added a whole new layer of complexity to this fight that I had to dive into even deeper. Volkanovski has some of the best cardio in the entire sport, and we know that he's been working hard on his wrestling to fight against Islam and to utilize wrestling against Yair Rodriguez, which we know is Yair's weakness. So that brings me to the question, can he out-wrestle Ilia Topuria? And that is a difficult question to answer because we have never really seen someone wrestle Ilia Topuria. Let's first start answering this question by talking about Alexander Volkanovski's wrestling. Against Yair Rodriguez, Alexander Volkanovski quite obviously wanted to wrestle him. We can see how he kept hunting for clinches and was trying to take Yair down whenever the opportunity presented itself. The first takedown happened in round 1 when Yair threw a body kick, which Alexander Volkanovski caught, and then from there it was simple to get Yair off balance, transition to a semi-double leg, and take him down. But taking down Yair Rodriguez is not really any feat to write home about. He falls over by himself. And surprisingly, Volkanovski wasn't really able to hold Yair down that well. Yair utilized a scissor sweep here to create distance, and then he pushed him off, and from there he was actually able to stand back up. And even though he wasn't able to break out of this clinch, the fact that he got out of Volkanovski from being on top of him to this position makes me think that Ilia Topuria can do this and then some. We can also see that getting into the clinch scenarios against an opponent like Ilia Topuria can be difficult, as we've seen Volkanovski get countered before when he is blitzing down his opponents, and when he is clinching with his opponents, he is sacrificing defense for trying to get his hands around them. And if Yair Rodriguez landed this right hand, imagine what Ilia Topuria's right hand landed on Volkanovski can do. Volkanovski ate the punch well here, and he eventually got the clinch, but still, if this was Ilia Topuria, I think that it could be a completely different story. When we talk about the clinch, I think that it is also valuable to mention that Ilia Topuria can level change and shoot on Volkanovski, just as Volkanovski was able to wrestle the wrestler. I think that just mixing in wrestling, even if you are just doing to mix up your plan of attack, can be very useful, and Volkanovski has shown a susceptibility to this because his clinch work and phone booth boxing is so erratic, such as this moment when Islam Makhachev was basically given a single leg by Volkanovski. I think that this is something that Ilia Topuria could take advantage of. While we're talking about clinch work / phone booth boxing, let's go over some other instances where Volkanovski has utilized phone booth boxing, where basically he's just stepping toe to toe with his opponent and they're both swinging for the fences. So in round 1, he actually gets dropped by the bigger fighter here, Islam Makhachev, who lands a right hand kind of to Volkanovski's neck, or it's a left hand to Volkanovski's neck, which actually sits him down to a knee. And we also need to just look at the defense of his opponent. Not only is Islam being fairly defensively sound, but none of Volkanovski's punches are landing really accurately. It doesn't even look like he's looking where his punches are going. Again, in round 2, Volkanovski steps in and throws a wild left hook reminiscent of Josh Emmett, something that we can directly compare to Ilia Topuria. Islam just shells up and returns fire, and then Volk returns fire. And then again, Islam just is able to clinch here and land a very solid knee to Volkanovski, again showing Volkanovski's susceptibility in this phone booth situation to being clinched or taken down. Another thing that we need to think about when we're talking about Volkanovski's striking game and his defense for striking is his susceptibility to kicks, not only leg kicks but also body kicks. It is worrying that his reaction to getting kicked is to squat down and lean his head forward. This is a tendency that really got him punished when he fought against Islam Makhachev in the rematch. Of course, getting head kicked by Islam and knocked out for the first time in his career. And then again, we can just see another clean body kick lands on Volkanovski in round 2 of their first fight. And then other strikes that work on Volkanovski are jabs. He has shown a susceptibility to being jabbed, which is notable because Ilia Topuria has a very good jab that he used against Josh Emmett. Islam was able to land a few good jabs against Volkanovski, and of course these are only going to work if you have Volkanovski's attention focused on something else, such as your wrestling, your kicks, your hooks. All of these are things that I think Ilia Topuria can get Volkanovski's attention on. Good jab by Yair Rodriguez. And then lastly, Volkanovski is short, so uppercuts are always going to be a threat against him, especially when his defense is ducking down. So turning a hook that would have gone over his head when he ducks down into an uppercut uppercut which would connect clean when Volkanovski's ducking is something that I think Ilia Topuria can also take advantage of. Again, a nice little shovel uppercut by Yair Rodriguez lands as Volkanovski's trying to move backwards. This is just a great example of Volkanovski's defensive footwork here, where Yair Rodriguez is chasing him down with a combination. Volkanovski shows excellent lateral movement, shuffling sideways away from the attack, and then also when Yair has him pinned up against the cage, more lateral movement and amazing positional awareness of the octagon in order to not only escape the attack but also shuffle out from the cage so that now he is in the center of the octagon and not his opponent. Great work from Volkanovski there, and that is definitely going to be a tool that he's going to use to stop Ilia Topuria from pressuring him up against the cage where he can start teeing off on him. This is just an example of Ilia's jabs here. Some, again, great jabs from Ilia Topuria, and I think that this is going to be a major tool in him trying to stay patient against Volkanovski. This is where I think Ilia Topuria can really thrive. If he completes the first step of staying patient and the second step of landing good jabs and leg kicks to try to draw reactions out of Volkanovski, then he has Volkanovski rushing into him. And if he can initiate these firefight situations, such as the phone booth brawl that Volkanovski performed many times against Islam, then I think Topuria's chances of winning this fight increase dramatically. Ilia has such good defensive awareness, yet offensive capabilities in these situations, ducking underneath Josh Emmett's hooks and throwing hooks of his own. And again, Topuria is even getting hit here, although I guess that's landing on his chest, but Topuria has a very good chin, so I think that if he needs to eat a punch to deal a punch to Volkanovski, that is a deal that he is always going to take. This is a great example of Topuria countering an overextended punch from his opponent, something that we've seen Volkanovski do many times throughout his career. Josh Emmett swings with a huge overhand right, ducks under a shot, and then Topuria takes an angle, counters with a right hook of his own, follows it up with an uppercut, just lands touching with the tips of his glove, and then another nice overhand right through Josh Emmett's guard, sitting him down. Here, at 16 seconds left of round 2, Josh Emmett goes in for a blitz, and Topuria counters with an overhand right. This is the exact same combination we saw from Volkanovski against Islam, and Islam was able to counter Volkanovski with an overhand right. And here we can see that Topuria's countering Emmett with an overhand right. To great effect, he hurts Emmett here and then goes in with grappling. This breakdown is almost over, I promise. All of this being said, do I think Ilia Topuria is a better striker than Alexander Volkanovski? No. But the areas of striking that Ilia Topuria excels at are specifically suitable to take advantage of the weaknesses that Alexander Volkanovski has in his striking game. These are the weaknesses that we saw Islam Makhachev take advantage of in both their first fight and their second fight. And I think Ilia Topuria is one of the only fighters at featherweight that also can take advantage of these weaknesses, such as the blitzing in a linear line, the willingness to engage in phone booth boxing, where both guys are standing toe-to-toe and just swinging wildly. I think that Ilia Topuria not only can eat the shots that Volkanovski is going to present him with, but he can dish out more punishment than he'd receive if he engages in that phone booth boxing. And I think Topuria's defensive acumen is going to be enough to keep him safe from Volkanovski's in and out, be first and last style, and force him into the style where he's engaging his opponents on his opponents' terms, forcing situations out of Volkanovski where he can counter him, such as what Islam Makhachev did. So, is Volkanovski a better striker than Ilia? I think against a lot of opponents, he is. But against Ilia, I think that he is going to have to rely on his wrestling. So let's talk about his wrestling here. As I said before, getting into the clinch is going to be a dangerous process. Volkanovski likes to blitz into the clinch. Ilia is not going to give him the opportunities to clinch up with him like Yair Rodriguez did, or get easy takedowns like Yair Rodriguez did. And he is going to punish Volkanovski for blitzing into the clinch with hooks, with uppercuts, with strong collar ties, and with knees, such as we see against Bryce Mitchell here with a minute and a half left of round 1, where Bryce Mitchell clinches up with Ilia, and Ilia grabs a collar tie, lands a hard knee into Bryce's stomach. Volkanovski is shorter than Bryce Mitchell, and we saw Volkanovski eat knee after knee against Islam in both of their fights. Knees up the middle to Volkanovski are going to be a big tool for Ilia Topuria, and something that I think can deter Volkanovski from engaging in the clinch, and if not deter him, make it more difficult for him to utilize the cardio advantage that I imagine he has over Ilia. Ilia's takedown defense is good. It is not insane, but it is very good. The only fighters we've really seen try to take Ilia down are Ryan Hall, although that you can say is some jiu-jitsu magic takedowns and not wrestling takedowns like what we'll see Volkanovski do, and Bryce Mitchell. Topuria's takedown defense mostly consists of backing up to the cage and then fighting the hands of his opponent. You can see Bryce Mitchell's on a single leg here. He fights the hands, and even though Bryce Mitchell eventually gets him down, he pops right back up. See, in this situation, Bryce Mitchell steps through, separates his legs, gets Topuria down, but immediately Topuria is working him back up. This is different from what Volkanovski experienced against Yair, where Yair would be content to lay on his back and work submissions and elbows from his back. Ilia is not going to do that. He is going to use the cage to stand back up immediately, position himself against the cage in a safe position, and then start working on breaking the grip of his opponent. And while Volkanovski is strong, I think that his grip can be broken by Ilia. One worrying thing is that with a minute left in the round, Bryce Mitchell got a takedown on Ilia, and Ilia did decide to stay in guard until the round ended. Maybe that's because he had already done damage that round and he didn't feel like it was worth expending the energy to try to stand back up because there was only a minute left. But either way, Bryce Mitchell was able to hold Ilia down, having his closed guard for a minute, which is a position that Volkanovski would love to get because Volkanovski's ground and pound is actually very good, in large part due to his long arms. Topuria has very good takedown defense. The one issue is if he gets taken down in open space, what is he going to do? And I think that's an area that Volkanovski can take big advantage of in the fight. But considering that Volkanovski likes to pressure his opponents up against the cage to try to ground and pound them, like he did to Yair and like he did to Brian Ortega, I think that that can be an opportunity for Topuria to get back up to his feet, even if he eats a few punches. So, what is going to happen in this fight? I am so excited to see the fight and to see if my perfect record of predicting main events can last. Let's recap what we went over in this video. Volkanovski has great striking. However, I think Ilia's unique strengths in the striking department are great counters to what Volkanovski's weaknesses are. Volkanovski has been working heavily on his wrestling. I think that his cardio can outlast Ilia's cardio, but the question is, can he implement his grappling game plan enough to see that cardio advantage actually take effect in the fight? It doesn't matter how great your cardio is, if you're not forcing your opponent to use their cardio, it's meaningless. So what do I think is actually going to happen in the fight? I think the first round is going to be a lot of tit for tat between Volkanovski and Ilia. I know Ilia said that he believes he's going to knock out Volkanovski in the first round. However, he has also gone on to say that he doesn't care if that knockout doesn't come to fruition, and I personally don't think it will. I think that the first round is going to be a lot of feeling out between the two fighters, with Volkanovski initiating clinches when he can, trying to press Ilia up against the cage, landing not really ground and pound, but holding Ilia with one arm, trying to punch him in the face or the stomach, or knee him with the other. I think Ilia is going to be breaking out of these clinches and still going tit for tat. I think that the longer the fight goes on, the more both fighters open up. I think Volkanovski is going to land a lot of strikes, and I think Ilia might start picking up on Volkanovski's timing by a late second round and start countering him over the top or engaging with him on these phone booth boxing brawls that Volkanovski loves to do, even though they're not good for his health. And I think we might start seeing Ilia hurting Volkanovski by the late second round, mid third round area, and then carrying on the fight from there, landing bigger shots, even if he's landing less total shots than Volkanovski. And that's going to lead me to my prediction. I think we're going to see Ilia Topuria win by decision. And it pains me to pick against Volkanovski because I love this fighter. I love this man. He has been such a great addition to the UFC, and especially to the featherweight division and the lightweight division for that matter, putting on so many classics. And I know the over 35 curse is something that people are talking about, and that Volkanovski is going to break it, or you shouldn't pay attention to his knockout loss because that's not going to affect him and it was on short notice. But the patterns that caused him to lose that fight against Makhachev were there before that fight, and I'm not taking into account his age. I'm not taking into account the fact that he got knocked out in his last fight. I just really think this is a bad stylistic matchup for Volkanovski. I think that Ilia's jab is going to just force Volkanovski to fight in an aggressive way that is not beneficial to him winning. And ultimately, I see him taking big punches, like how Islam Makhachev landed big strikes winning rounds. The elbow in round 3 that cut open Volkanovski's face. The counter left straight in round 2, which sent Volkanovski reeling back across the cage. How he dropped Volkanovski in round 1 when Volkanovski was trying to rush in and trade punches with him in the phone booth. I just easily see Ilia Topuria doing all of those. And to be honest, except for the idea that Volkanovski can just hold Ilia Topuria up against the cage for the majority of 3 rounds and win on the scorecards, I don't see a way Alexander Volkanovski beats Ilia. I don't think his striking matches up well against Ilia's striking. Now, I could be very well wrong. If Volkanovski can find a way to consistently take Topuria down to the ground, I think he can win the fight. But I don't think Topuria's takedown defense is going to allow Volkanovski to be that consistent. It's going to be such a great fight, and I honestly don't even care. I don't even care if I'm wrong and it's boring and Volkanovski's just holding Ilia up against the cage, because at the very least we'll get maybe a round and a half of scrambles between these two guys, and that's going to be great. But ultimately, the reason why I'm going with Ilia is because I don't think Volkanovski's wrestling is that good. If he was barely able to hold down Yair Rodriguez, I don't think he's going to be able to hold down Ilia. And even though Bryce Mitchell held down Ilia for over a minute, I think that Ilia's getting so much better between fights that he's not going to have a problem getting back up. When Volkanovski said that he was going to wrestle Ilia, that really caused me to change my mind and sway towards Volkanovski for winning it. And then I rewatched the Yair Rodriguez fight, and Yair was getting up multiple times. Volkanovski took him down 8 times that fight. And that's Yair Rodriguez. He's going to be fighting a stronger, smaller, shorter guy. Way better wrestling in Ilia Topuria. I think he's going to realize that it's a struggle, man. I don't know if he's going to be able to hold Ilia down. Ultimately, I think it's going to be a back and forth battle, but in the end, I think Ilia's going to be dealing more damage to Volkanovski every round. Maybe he's going to lose the first 2 rounds, but I think he's going to start figuring out Volkanovski, start dealing damage to him, and I don't think Volkanovski's going to be able to implement his wrestling game plan enough to see that cardio difference start to take effect. Well, that's my official prediction. Ilia Topuria by decision. Right now, Ilia Topuria is at plus 105. Him by decision is plus 375. I definitely think the fight goes long. If you can take over 1.5 rounds, I would do it. I think it's going to take Ilia a bit longer than the first round to start finding homes for his bigger punches. And I don't think either fighter's really going to start opening up and just start going for it until midway through the second round. I think it's going to be a very tentative feeling out process, with the exception of Volkanovski kind of barreling in to try to clinch up with Ilia and tire him out, landing little punches up against the cage. Well, I'm excited for this fight. I'm definitely going to be watching it, and I will be back to break down what I got right, what I got completely wrong, and all of the other great fights on this card. And of course, I'll be back next week to break down next week's main event. Thank you all for watching. Let me know what you thought of the breakdown down below. Let me know if you have any ideas for what I could do differently for these breakdown videos, or what other content you would like to see from me. Let me know who you think's gonna win, and I will see you later.